My name is Helen. I am 34 years old, a master goldsmith, and the founder of Abernathy and Company. In the quiet, high-stakes world of rare gems, my name carries the weight of a heavy vault door. But in the drafty hallways of my own history, I have always been the younger sister who fiddles with rocks, the one who stays in the shadows so the rest of the Gideon family can stand in the light. For a long time, I accepted that my purpose was to be the quiet architect of their comfort, the invisible hand that caught them every time they tripped over their own vanity. I didn't realize that when you spend your life being a safety net, people eventually forget you're a human being and start treating you like a piece of equipment. The realization didn't come with a lecture or a loud argument. It came on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:14 p.m. in Charleston, South Carolina. The heat in my workshop, a space I call the forge, was heavy with the metallic tang of soldering flux and the sweet, cloying scent of polishing compound. I was hunched over my bench, adjusting a microscopic prong on a limited edition piece, when a white-hot blade of pain sliced through my lower right abdomen. I didn't have time to scream. My breath hitched, and the world tilted. I slid off my stool, the cold concrete floor meeting my cheek with a dull thud. My first thought wasn't about the $80,000 commission sitting unguarded on my bench. It was about Leo. My 4-year-old son was upstairs, deep in his afternoon nap. If I slipped into shock here, he would wake up to a locked house and a mother who couldn't answer his calls. I have always been the one to handle things, to manage the crisis. But for the first time in my life, I was the crisis. My fingers felt like lead as I reached for my phone. I didn't call an ambulance first. I called my sister, Tinsley. I suppose some part of me was still desperate for the family myth to be true. The idea that blood shows up when the world gets dark. I looked through the reinforced glass of my second-story window, which overlooked the street. Across the cobblestones, not 50 yards away, sat a sidewalk cafe with blue and white striped umbrellas. There she was. Tinsley was sitting under one of those umbrellas, her hair perfectly coiffed, wearing oversized sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was laughing, her head tilted back, holding a latte as if she were in the middle of a photo shoot. My phone vibrated against my ear as the call connected. "Tinsley," I whispered, my voice thin and ragged. "I'm in trouble. I think it's my appendix. I'm going into shock and Leo is upstairs. Please. You're right across the street. I need you to come get him." I watched her through the window. She didn't look toward my building. She didn't even flinch. She picked up her phone with a manicured hand, glanced at the screen, and then put it back down on the table. A second later, a notification banner appeared on my screen. "I'm actually at a spa appointment across town for the wedding prep," her text read. "I can't leave. Leo is a big boy, Helen. Don't be so dramatic. You're ruining my only day off. Figure it out." I watched her take a slow, deliberate sip of her oat milk latte. She wasn't across town. She was right there. She chose a cup of coffee and a conversation with a socialite over her own sister's life and her nephew's safety. I realized then that I haven't been forgotten by this family. I've been erased. I was only relevant when I was signing a check or fixing a problem. The pain flared again, a jagged lightning bolt in my gut. I didn't beg. I didn't call her back. I reached into my pocket and hit the internal distress beacon on my Abernathy security fob. In 8 minutes, the street was filled with the rhythmic thump of a private security detail. Caspian was the first through the door. He didn't ask questions. He saw the sweat on my forehead and the gray tint of my skin. He picked up Leo, who was still rubbing sleep from his eyes, while a private paramedic team loaded me onto a stretcher. Caspian looked at my phone, still clutched in my hand, and saw the text message from Tinsley. Then he looked across the street at the cafe, where my sister was now staring at the commotion with a look of mild annoyance, as if the sirens were interrupting her vibe. "I saw it, Helen," Caspian said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Focus on breathing. I'll handle the house. I'll handle Leo. You focus on surviving." As they wheeled me out into the humid Charleston air, the sunlight hit my face, and a strange clarity washed over me. It was a cold, surgical kind of peace. I reached for my phone one last time. Face ID clicked. I opened my private banking portal, the one that fueled the Gideon family's old money lifestyle. For 6 years, I had maintained a discretionary fund for my parents and a secondary credit line for Tinsley. I had told myself it was my duty to protect the legacy. I revoked the authorization for the Gideon and Rowena lifestyle account. I clicked disable on Tinsley's secondary Amex. I changed my passwords. I enabled two-factor authentication. There was no dramatic flourish, no shouting match. Just the soft, haptic click of a screen. It didn't feel like anger. It felt like setting down a suitcase full of lead I had been carrying for a decade. A bridge is only as strong as its supports, and I was tired of being the only stone holding up their cathedral while they threw rocks at me from the pulpit. We passed Tinsley's table as they loaded me into the ambulance. She finally stood up, her face turning a ghostly pale as she recognized the black Abernathy security uniforms and Caspian's sharp, unforgiving gaze. She reached for her designer bag, likely intending to pay her tab and run before she had to explain why she was sitting there. I saw her hand the waiter a black titanium card, the one I paid for. The siren drowned out the sound of the waiter telling her the transaction was declined. It was the first time in 10 years she had to figure out how to pay for her own coffee. And I knew as the doors of the ambulance hissed shut, it wouldn't be the last. 6 days later, after the surgeons had removed the infection from my body and I was sitting in the silence of my own recovery, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't my family. It was a courier with a certified letter that would change the trajectory of the next 2 months. Now let me take you back to the autumn of 2020 in Charleston, South Carolina. The humidity that usually grips the lowcountry like a wet wool blanket had finally broken, leaving the air crisp and thin. In our family home, a sprawling colonial on a street where the oak trees are older than the Constitution, the silence was always heavy with the cost of keeping up appearances. People often ask me how I could let my family treat me the way they did for so long. They look at the ambulance siren from that Tuesday afternoon and wonder why it took a near-death experience to finally cut the cord. But the truth is, it wasn't a sudden explosion. It was merely the final, predictable creaking of a structure that had been decaying for 30 years. My collapse in the workshop was simply the moment when the weight of their self-proclaimed power finally broke through my endurance. To understand fire, you must understand the slow, steady leak of gas. In the Gideon house, love wasn't a gift. It was a ranked currency. You didn't just receive it, you occupied a specific slot for it, and the slots were never equal. My father, Gideon, was the self-appointed judge of merit. My mother, Rowena, was the curator of our social status, and my sister, Tinsley, was their masterpiece. Tinsley was ethereal, radiant, a girl seemingly made for the golden hour of a camera lens. Rowena spent hours in Tinsley's room, brushing her hair and discussing which shade of silk would best capture the light of a Charleston ballroom. Tinsley was the portrait that hung in the gallery, bathed in soft spotlights. I was the frame that held it together, hidden behind the wall, and never meant to be noticed. I was the utility child. While Tinsley was celebrated for her beauty, I was managed for my usefulness. I was sturdy, silent, and had a permanent smudge of jeweler's rouge on my thumb by the time I was 20. They didn't see my talent as a career. They saw it as a handy hobby that could save them money on repairs. The pattern was set in stone during my graduation from the Gemology Institute. I had finished at the top of my class, a distinction that earned me a seat at the most prestigious tables in the industry. Gideon and Rowena showed up for the ceremony, but they left before the reception started. They didn't even wait for the champagne toast. Tinsley had a last-minute fitting for a debutante ball across town. And apparently, her hemline was more urgent than my honors degree. Gideon didn't offer an apology. He just patted my shoulder with a hand that had never known a day of manual labor and said, "You have your degree now, Helen. You don't need a party to prove you're smart. Your sister needs us there. She's the face of this family after all." I swallowed the lump in my throat, straightened my graduation gown, and went to the reception alone. I told myself it made sense. Tinsley was fragile. She needed the constant reinforcement of their presence. I was the strong one. I didn't need the applause to know the clarity of a diamond. But strength is often just a fancy word for a high tolerance for pain. The most bitter realization came a few months later. I had been working 2 jobs during trade school, saving every penny of my tips and commission. I had exactly $12,000 in a savings account. I wanted to buy a reliable truck, something that could haul my heavy casting equipment and rough stone shipments without breaking down. I came home one afternoon to find a brand new, shimmering white BMW in the driveway. Tinsley was sitting in the driver's seat, squealing as she filmed an Instagram story. Rowena was standing on the porch, beaming. When I walked inside, Gideon was sitting at the mahogany desk, looking over a stack of bank statements. My bank statements? "The BMW looks great, doesn't it?" Gideon said, not even looking up. Tinsley needed a car that matched her modeling portfolio. "I moved your savings over to cover the down payment. It's an investment in the family brand." I stood there, my ears ringing. "That was my tuition and equipment money, Dad. I needed that for a truck." Finally, he looked at me, his eyes cold and contemptuous. "You don't need a fancy car. Besides that dark workshop, where else would you go? You don't need a fancy car, Helen. Besides that dark workshop, where else would you go? Tinsley needs to protect his reputation in this city. You're a practical person, Helen. You'll find your way back. You always do." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I went up to my room and recalculated my budget. I rationalized it the way I always did. It's just money. I can earn more. If Tinsley succeeds, maybe they'll finally be happy. I was so busy being the strong one that I didn't realize I was actually being a volunteer for my own exploitation. I spent the next few years head down in my workshop, building Abernathy and Company, from nothing but grit and midnight oil. I became the ghost in the Gideon machine. I fixed the plumbing when the estate's pipes burst because Gideon had spent the maintenance budget on Tinsley's vacations. I handled Rowena's credit card disputes. I stayed invisible so they could shine. I thought I was just paying for their comfort. I thought I was buying their love with my silence. I didn't know then that the favoritism wasn't just emotional. It was financial. While I was focused on the microscopic facets of the stones on my bench, Gideon was looking at me and seeing an infinite line of credit. By the time Tinsley's wedding was announced, the Gideon and Rowena lifestyle account wasn't just a help. It was their heartbeat, and I was the one keeping the blood flowing, unaware that they were preparing to sacrifice me on the altar of their own vanity. I was about to pay for a life I wasn't allowed to live, and the bill was going to be much higher than $12,000. The weather in Charleston has a way of convincing you that things are softer than they really are. Between 2021 and 2024, a strange, warm front moved into the Gideon family home. The sharp edges of my father's judgment seemed to round out, and my mother's obsession with Tinsley's social calendar expanded just enough to include me. It felt like healing. It felt like the years of being the invisible frame were finally over, and I was being invited into the light. My mother began bringing tea to my workshop on Tuesday afternoons. She would sit on the velvet armchair I kept for clients, smoothing her skirt, asking about the logistics of my business. She wanted to know how many carats of raw emeralds were in the vault, who the private buyers in New York were, and what kind of profit margins a genius goldsmith like me could command. Tinsley would text every morning, her messages peppered with heart emojis and questions about my day. "How is my brilliant sister? Are the stones speaking to you today?" For a long time, the hunger for that attention made me talkative. I told them about the private auctions in Antwerp. I explained the markup on a custom platinum setting. I shared the names of the estate lawyers who managed my dividends. It felt like connection. I didn't see a survey of my resources. I saw a family finally taking an interest in my soul. A predator doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it just sits very still and learns your patterns. The shift from interest to acquisition happened on a rainy Tuesday in 2022. Gideon sat in the chair my mother usually occupied. He looked tired, the skin beneath his eyes sagging with a weight he hadn't earned. "Helen, just this once," he said, his voice lowering into a confidential hum. "The property taxes on the estate are overdue. The city is being difficult. Only for a month. 4,500. I remember the sensation of my thumb hovering over the send button on my banking app. I felt a surge of pride. I was finally the one they turned to. I wasn't just practical anymore. I was essential. I thought I was buying a seat at the table. I didn't know I was just paying the lease on my own welcome. That 1 month became every month. The Helen Gideon bridge loan evolved into the Gideon and Rowena lifestyle account. It became a recurring transfer, a digital heartbeat that kept their mirage of wealth alive. The escalation followed a precise ladder. First, it was $2,000 a month for utilities. Then it was $5,000 for estate maintenance. By the third year, the emergencies were a weekly occurrence. Tinsley's modeling portfolio fees, Rowena's charity gala table costs, Gideon's bad stock bets that he swore would turn around by next quarter. Whenever I hesitated, my mother would pat my hand, her voice dripping with that cloying, poisoned honey. "You're so lucky, Helen. You have a job that allows you to be so useful. It's the only way you can really contribute to a family of our standing. We're so proud of how you help us maintain the Gideon name." I began keeping a spreadsheet on my laptop, hidden in a folder labeled "End of Transaction." I saved every statement. I archived every screenshot of their thank you texts, the ones that never included a plan for repayment. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, reason. Column D, notes. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, the total was $412,800. I was feeding them my life's work, and they were consuming it without even checking if I was full. The false peace snapped back into reality the moment I opened my eyes in the hospital bed on Tuesday evening. The anesthesia from the appendectomy made the room feel underwater. My stomach was stitched with what felt like burning wire. I was reaching for the call button when the curtain was ripped back. Rowena didn't enter with flowers. She didn't ask how the surgery went, or if the pain had subsided. She didn't ask if Leo was okay. She stood at the foot of my bed, her designer heels clicking aggressively on the linoleum, her phone clutched in her hand like a blunt instrument. "Helen!" she hissed, her face flushed with a frantic, selfish energy. "I was at the florist for Tinsley's wedding. The card was declined. The bank told me the account was frozen. Then I tried the lifestyle portal and it's gone. What have you done? Are you trying to steal from us to make up for your own failure? How could you be so irresponsible when your sister's wedding is only weeks away?" I looked at my mother. I felt the tug of the stitches in my side, but the physical ache was distant compared to the clarity in the room. She was only here because the faucet had stopped running. I had handed them the keys to my life for years, and they were furious that I had finally changed the locks. "The account isn't broken, Mother," I said. My voice was a dry whisper, thin as parchment. "It's finished." "You're being dramatic again," she snapped, checking her reflection in the darkened window as if my recovery were a background prop in her own drama. "Gideon is on his way. You'll fix this? or you won't be welcome at that wedding. Do you understand? We have guests coming from all over the country. We won't be embarrassed by your tantrum." I didn't answer. I just watched her pace the small room, calculating how much she could squeeze out of a woman who was currently being held together by medical staples. I had spent years providing the ammunition. I had given them every detail, every cent, every key. I had printed the receipts, but they hadn't realized yet that the audit had already begun. The reckoning was coming, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to have to pay the bill. April 14th. 2 weeks after the surgeons cut the infection out of my body and stitched me back together with meticulous clinical precision. Everything cracked open on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in Charleston was beginning to carry the heavy floral scent of jasmine, a smell that usually signals the start of the tourist season, but that year, it only smelled like the onset of a fever. I was sitting in my living room, moving with the stiff, guarded gait of someone whose torso felt like it was held together by thin glass threads. I was still wearing the yellow fall risk wristband from the hospital, a plastic reminder that I was not as unbreakable as I liked to think. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a lawnmower a few blocks over. The doorbell rang at 2:15 p.m. It wasn't the rhythmic, familiar knock of a friend. It was the sharp, impatient buzzer of a courier. He handed me a certified envelope from South Carolina First National Bank. The sound of the heavy bond paper tearing open was the only noise in the room, but it felt as loud as a gunshot. It was a notice of intent to foreclose on the forge. My lungs seemed to seize. I scrolled past the legal jargon to the heart of the document. Case number 7742-G. It listed a $500,000 equity line of credit taken out 3 months ago. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It said, Helen Gideon. The H was slightly too ornate, the G a fraction too shaky. Gideon had forged it. I knew exactly where I was on the date listed. January 12th. I was in Antwerp, sitting in a secure vault under the Diamond Quarter, bidding on the very stones that would eventually become Abernathy and Company's spring collection. I had the passport stamps, the flight logs, and the digital trail to prove it. But in that moment, the physical sensation of my stitches pulling as my breath hitched was the only reality that mattered. It was 2:45 p.m. The clock on the mantel ticked with an aggressive, taunting rhythm. Leo's preschool let out at 3:30 p.m., and my doctor had forbidden me from driving for another week. My incision was weeping, a dark spot of moisture beginning to bloom on the side of my linen shirt. I was in no state to walk the 6 blocks to the school, let alone navigate the afternoon traffic. I opened the Gideon Family Hub group chat. My hands were steady, though my chest felt hollowed out. I sent a voice note. My voice was level, thin, but unmistakable. I can't drive yet. I just found a bank notice regarding the forge. Gideon, we need to talk about January 12th. I'm bleeding through my bandages and I can't get to Leo. Can someone please pick him up? It's only 10 minutes from the estate. I watched the screen. Seen by Rowena. Seen by Tinsley. Rowena replied 30 seconds later. She didn't ask about the bank notice. She didn't ask why I was bleeding. She sent a high-resolution photo of Tinsley standing on a pedestal, draped in a froth of white chantilly lace that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. We are at Tinsley's final fitting at the Riviera Ballroom, my mother typed. The designer is here from New York. We have the champagne brunch afterward with the wedding coordinator. Why are you always such a nuisance, Helen? You're so dramatic. Call an Uber and stop trying to ruin your sister's big week. We don't have time for your emergencies. Tinsley added a single reaction to my mother's text. A emoji. Then a second text from Rowena popped up. A casual afterthought that felt like a serrated blade across my throat. By the way, I had the cleaners empty out that storage room at the house this morning to make room for Tinsley's wedding shoes and the overflow of gifts. I told them to throw out that rusty old toolbox and that heavy dented hammer you keep in there. It was an eyesore and made the hallways smell like a garage. If you still want to be a blacksmith, go buy some new tools that don't look like they came from a scrap heap. The hammer. Abernathy's hammer. The tool my mentor had placed in my hand when I was 14. The one that had taught me how to move metal before I knew how to move through the world. It was the only piece of my history that didn't have the Gideon name on it. And my mother had sent it to a landfill to make room for a pair of silk pumps. Caspian arrived 10 minutes later to drop off insurance paperwork. He found me standing in the center of the room, staring at the phone. He didn't offer pity. He had worked for me long enough to know that pity was an insult. He saw the scene status on the group chat. He saw the laughing emoji. He saw the red stain on my shirt. Caspian pulled out his own phone and took a photo of my screen. "For the file," he said. His voice was like low-frequency granite. "I need a car for Leo," I said. My voice didn't shake. I had moved past the point where tears were a physiological possibility. "I've already called the private transport," Caspian replied. "They'll be at the preschool in 8 minutes. I've authorized the triple time rate. Focus on the incision, Helen. I'll bring Leo home." The official paper trail began that afternoon. I kept the receipt for the $450 medical transport fee. I saved the timestamp of Caspian's arrival. I had the medical log from my post-op nurse who arrived 20 minutes later to change my dressing. As the nurse worked, I looked out the window at the Charleston skyline. I thought about the hammer in the landfill and the $500,000 lie sitting on my coffee table. Strangers had shown up to ensure my son's safety. Strangers had taken better care of my dignity than my own parents. The weight of the realization settled in the center of my chest, heavy and cold. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table that was built on my own stolen lumber. I had been convenient for them, a utility to be used until the parts wore out. That was the afternoon the Gideon family stopped being my home and started being a legal liability. I wasn't the sensitive one anymore. I was the auditor. And for the Gideon family, the window for a settlement had just slammed shut. My home in the historic district usually feels like a sanctuary, a place where the air smells of cedar wood and the cool, metallic tang of the jewelry I spend my life perfecting. But as I sat at my workbench 3 days after the ambulance ride, the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of focus. It was the silence of a clean break. I was changing my own bandage, the medical tape giving a sharp, dry tug against my skin. My eyes drifted to the faint yellowing of a bruise on my forearm where the IV had been. I picked up a cold cup of Earl Grey tea, the steam long gone, and looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the workshop. I had 2 paths in front of me. I could continue to allow the Gideon family to use my energy as their primary fuel, or I could stop being the battery for a life I wasn't allowed to lead. I could crumble under the weight of their latest betrayal, or I could climb out of the hole they had dug for me. The answer came with the soft blue glow of my laptop screen. I opened my banking app. It was a clinical experience, looking at the Gideon and Rowena lifestyle account recurring transfers. For 10 years, I had been the silent architect of their comfort, paying for a table that never had a chair with my name on it. I looked at the numbers and saw not currency, but years of my life siphoned away into a vacuum of vanity. I didn't hesitate. I worked through the list like a surgeon performing a necessary amputation. Cancel. Estate landscaping. Recurring. Cancel. Rowena. Personal discretionary. Disable. Tinsley Amex. Secondary user. I changed my master passwords. I enabled 2-factor authentication, tethering the heart of my financial empire to my own thumbprint and nothing else. I opened my contacts and moved the Gideon family hub to the block list. There were no tears. There was only the sound of a haptic click. It felt like setting down a lead suitcase I had been carrying since the day I turned 24. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was healing. Caspian arrived an hour later. He didn't bring flowers. He brought a small velvet pouch. Inside was the solace necklace, the piece I had spent 6 months designing for myself. The piece Tinsley and my mother had already dismissed as flea market trash. "How are you? Really?" Caspian asked, his eyes scanning the room, checking for any signs of the exhaustion he knew I was hiding. "Better," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time in a decade, I've stopped negotiating with people who only see me as a utility. The rehearsal dinner at the Riviera Country Club was the following evening. I arrived late, the humidity of Charleston clinging to the white marble pillars of the estate. The ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers and forced smiles, a masterpiece of old money theater. I wore a simple charcoal gray silk dress, a piece of my own design that moved like liquid smoke. I was barely through the door when my father, Gideon, intercepted me. He didn't ask about my surgery. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my dress and then glanced nervously toward Tinsley's future in-laws, who were holding court at the head table. "Helen," he said, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Tinsley's wedding coordinator mentioned you were coming. I've had the staff move your name tag. You're at table 18, near the kitchen doors. It's for the extended acquaintances and the event staff. You look tired. It's better for everyone if you stay out of the official photos. We have a certain image to maintain tonight." The maid's seat. I looked at the table he pointed to. A folding chair tucked behind a heavy floral arrangement, far from the light. I didn't argue. I didn't plead for my place. I simply nodded and walked to table 18. I sat between a weary photographer and a catering lead. From the shadows, I had a perfect view of the farce. I watched Tinsley toast to a future built on a foundation that had just been removed. I watched my mother laugh with Funan Vance, unaware that the card in her silk clutch was now a useless piece of plastic. During the second course, I excused myself to find more water. I passed the club manager's office and saw a discarded folder on a mahogany sideboard labeled Gideon/Wedding Logistics. My father had always been careless with paperwork he deemed administrative. I opened the folder. My heart didn't race. It went cold. Inside was a copy of a letter Gideon had written to the Country Club Board of Governors 3 days ago. "I am requesting the formal removal of Helen Gideon from the junior membership list." The letter read, "Her financial instability and erratic behavior have become a liability to our family's standing. She is prone to dramatic outbursts and no longer reflects the values of this institution." He was attempting to socially execute me using the very status I had been paying for. The irony was of physical weight. He was trying to throw me out of the club using my own dividends to pay for the letterhead the request was printed on. I pulled out my phone and took a clear, high-resolution photo of the letter. I slipped it into my digital binder, next to the forgery documents. I caught Caspian's eye across the room. I gave him a single, measured nod. He knew what it meant. The board was set. Every piece was in place. I returned to table 18 and finished my water. I sat in the shadows, watching my family celebrate a mirage. I knew the fallout was coming. Gideon would realize the lifestyle account was empty long before he realized his daughter had finally left the building. I didn't expect the reckoning to be quiet. I expected it to be expensive. I watched the clock, counting the minutes until the theater would finally end. The bank was closing its doors, and for the Gideon family, there was no overnight deposit that could save them now. Friday morning arrived with a stillness that felt earned. I was in my kitchen, the low-country light hitting the copper pots on the wall, turning them into warm, glowing shields. The smell of maple syrup and butter filled the room as I flipped pancakes for Leo. I watched his small hand grip his fork, his eyes focused on the task of eating. A simple, honest moment in a life I was finally reclaiming. The Family Hub group chat on my phone sat silent and muted, a dead channel at the bottom of my notifications list. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a sanctuary. But a phantom limb still aches long after it's gone. I caught myself setting 3 plates at the breakfast nook instead of 2. I looked at the empty seat where my mother used to sit during her logistics visits, and I felt that familiar, sharp pang between my ribs. The hollow echo of the family I had tried so hard to build from the ruins of their indifference. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased from their narrative because I stopped being their benefactor. I was learning to love the silence, but the air in Charleston was beginning to hum with the heavy electricity of a gathering storm. The storm broke at 10:14 p.m. My phone didn't ring, but a haptic vibration pulsed against my nightstand. A rhythmic, urgent series of taps from the Abernathy and Company security server. I sat up, the pull of my surgery stitches a sharp reminder of my vulnerability. I didn't call Caspian. I simply opened my tablet. It took 4 minutes for the encrypted feed to bypass the local hub, and 6 minutes to review the event log from the previous hour. The infrared camera in my guest suite, the room I had prepared for Tinsley's pre-wedding piece, showed a figure in a silk robe. My sister. She was hunched over my workbench, her movements jerky and frantic. She had a pair of jeweler's pliers in her hand. Clumsy, amateur tools she must have bought at a hardware store. I watched as she struggled with the prongs of the solace necklace. She believed it was a fake, a plastic trinket I had bought to pretend I had taste. I watched the screen as she unseated the central stone, the $1.2 million pink solace diamond, and replaced it with a dull pink piece of crown glass she had likely harvested from a costume tiara. She was so confident in her disdain for me that she didn't even notice the microscopic laser-engraved serial number on the platinum gallery. Tinsley thought she was proving a point, that she was exposing my lies. She didn't realize that every Abernathy masterpiece contains a subsurface microchip for insurance tracking. By removing that stone, she had just activated a silent theft protocol. "Shall I intercept?" Caspian's voice came through the tablet's intercom, low and clinical. "We can have her detained before she reaches the driveway." I watched Tinsley admire her work in the mirror, a smirk of triumph crossing her face as she tucked the real diamond into her robe pocket. She looked radiant, even in the grainy infrared light, the radiant masterpiece the Gideons had always worshipped. "No," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Let her keep it. She just finished her own indictment. I want her to wear that confidence all the way to the altar." At 11:30 p.m., 3 measured knocks sounded at my front door. I didn't need to check the peephole. Caspian stood on the porch, his charcoal suit blending into the Charleston shadows. He didn't bring drama. He brought a manila folder thick with the weight of consequence. He stepped inside and laid an iPad on my kitchen island. On the screen, a single red tracking dot was glowing, moving steadily away from the historic district toward my father's estate. "The pink solace is currently in Rowena's jewelry vault," Caspian reported, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. He slid the Abernathy Founders card across the counter toward me, the black titanium card that proved my identity as the head of the empire. Beside it lay the printed ledger of the $3,412,800 I had spent on them over the last 6 years. "She stole a masterpiece to replace it with a lie, Helen," Caspian said quietly. "She's going to stand at that altar tomorrow wearing a trophy of her own theft." I looked at the folder. I thought about the 3,000 days I had spent trying to be good enough, trying to buy a glance of pride from a father who only saw my bank balance, and a mother who only saw my sister's face. I stood in 5 seconds of absolute measured silence, looking at my reflection in the darkened window. My phone vibrated one last time before I turned it off for the night. A text from Rowena. "Don't forget to wear that flea market necklace tomorrow, Helen. I want everyone to see what you consider luxury. It's time you learned your place. I'm ready, I said to Caspian. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to defend my worth. At that wedding, facts would speak. And for the first time in my life, I wouldn't have to say a single word to be heard. Saturday morning arrived at 8 a.m. with the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the high-end laser printer in my study. The air smelled of hot ink and heavy bond paper. I moved methodically, my fingers tracing the edges of the documents as they slid into the tray. The forged bank loan with case number 7742-G, the 6-year ledger of the lifestyle account, and the high-resolution screenshots of the group chat messages Tinsley had sent while I lay on the floor of my workshop. I snapped the metal rings of a navy blue leather binder. I applied clear, adhesive tabs with surgical precision. Financials, forgery, medical, communications. My hands were steady, the slight tremor from the adrenaline of finality finally settling into a cold, focused resolve. This wasn't a collection of grievances. It was an audit of a decade-long bankruptcy of character. Caspian stood by the door, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that mirrored the gravity of the morning. He watched as I slotted the last PDF into the sleeve. He stepped forward and flipped through the tabs, stopping at the final total on the last page. $3,412,800. He looked at me, his eyes hooded and sharp. 3.4 million, Helen, Caspian said, his voice a low-frequency anchor in the quiet room. And Gideon has spent the last 48 hours writing letters to board members calling you a financial liability. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I just felt the weight of the binder in my hand. Let the paper do the talking today, Caspian added, handing the folder back to me. You've spent enough breath trying to be heard. It's their turn to listen. I nodded once, checked the solace necklace in the mirror, the pink glass stone Tinsley had installed shimmering with a dull, deceptive light, and walked out to the car. The Riviera Country Club was a masterpiece of Charleston artifice. White colonial pillars, sprawling gardenias that smelled like funeral arrangements, and a string quartet playing Vivaldi on the terrace. The parking lot was a sea of Mercedes and Range Rovers, a gathering of the city's elite designed to celebrate Tinsley's perfect union. As I stepped out of the car, my phone vibrated. A text from a cousin I hadn't seen in 3 years. Helen, just a heads up. Gideon and Rowena have been telling everyone at the brunch that you had a complete nervous breakdown in the hospital. They're telling people you're sensitive and confused about the family finances. Just thought you should know before you walk in. They were discrediting the witness before I could even take the stand. Social gaslighting in its most refined form. I slipped the phone into my clutch and gripped the leather handle of the binder. I felt the collective shift in the room the moment I entered the ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged bourbon. There was a ripple of pity and suspicion that followed me as I walked toward the staff tables near the back. I heard the whispers, low and jagged. Is that her? The one who went erratic? I didn't look left or right. I wasn't a guest today. I was an auditor. Rowena approached me 10 minutes later, resplendent in champagne silk. She wore a practiced, performative smile that didn't reach her eyes. Helen, darling, she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby table to hear. You look, well, I'm glad you could make it. Not too much excitement for you today, I hope. We've made sure your seat is tucked away where it's nice and quiet. I looked my mother in the eye. I am quite well, ma'am. Thank you for asking. The use of ma'am was a scalpel. Rowena flinches, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Foon Han Vance, the most powerful social gatekeeper in Charleston, began walking toward our group. She was a woman who didn't just buy jewelry. She understood its history. She stopped, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the solace necklace. Rowena gave a forced laugh, her voice rising as she spoke to the guests around her. "Oh, Mrs. Vance, please don't mind my daughter's little trinkets. Helen has a habit of buying plastic trinkets at flea markets and convincing herself they're real diamonds. It's part of her recent instability. We felt it was best to go along with her. It's really quite embarrassing for the family." A few of the women at the nearby table tittered. Tinsley, standing 10 feet away in her white lace, smirked as she adjusted her veil. I felt the piece of glass Tinsley had planted against my skin. It was cold. Mrs. Vance didn't smile. She leaned closer to my neck, her gaze not on the gemstone, but on the platinum bezel and the tiny Abernathy and Company insignia. She glanced from the necklace to the file in my hand, then to Caspian, who stood a few steps away. A profound, silent understanding was etched on her face. She gave me a small, nearly imperceptible nod. She stepped back and placed her hand on the back of a chair near the podium, her eyes fixed on Gideon as he began to move toward the microphone. It was a signal. The room was no longer his. The string quartet fell silent. The room sank into a heavy, expectant silence. The host was about to announce his congratulations, but Gideon, sensing the shift in the room as Mrs. Vance looked at me, decided to act first. He wanted to take control of the conversation before anyone could ask inappropriate questions. Gideon stepped onto the podium and snatched the microphone before the host could utter a word. His face was flushed wine red, his posture full of the entitlement of a man who believed his name was his armor. "Before we begin the celebration," Gideon's voice boomed through the ballroom, amplified and harsh. "The family should know the truth. As many of you have noticed, my youngest daughter, Helen, is struggling. We wanted a quiet wedding, but unfortunately, her recent episodes and financial confusion have brought us to a difficult point. We are here to support her, of course, but the Gideon name cannot be tarnished by—" Gideon looked directly at me, a sneer twisting his lips as he prepared to deliver the final blow to my reputation. He didn't know that Caspian had already signaled the AV team. He didn't know that the binder on my lap was already open to the first page of the audit. Gideon thought he was winning the room. He didn't realize he was just providing the opening statement for his own cross-examination. The reception hall of the Riviera Country Club was a masterpiece of Charleston artifice. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across thousands of white peonies, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged bourbon. It was the kind of room designed to broadcast a specific narrative: that the Gideon family was untroubled, wealthy, and fundamentally superior. I sat at table 18, tucked into the far corner near the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen. My glass of lukewarm water reflected the flickering candles on the head table where Tinsley sat, a vision in lace and stolen confidence. I remained observant and entirely silent. I didn't need to speak. I was simply waiting for the weight of the air in the room to reach the breaking point. Gideon stood at the podium, clutching the microphone with a hand that sported a signet ring I had paid to have resized 6 months ago. He scanned the A-list crowd, the mayors, the judges, the socialites who curated this city's social hierarchy. Then, his gaze found me in the back. His face, already flushed with wine and self-importance, hardened into a mask of paternal disappointment. "Before we continue the celebration," Gideon's voice boomed through the speakers, "there is a matter of family integrity I must address." He pointed a trembling finger toward table 18. "Helen, I have asked you 3 times today to remove that plastic trinket from your neck. You chose to wear a flea market necklace to your sister's wedding. You are embarrassing Tinsley. You are embarrassing this family. It is a pathetic symbol of the instability we have tried so hard to hide for you." A wave of stifled laughter rippled through the ballroom. People turned in their gilded chairs to stare, their eyes filled with a mixture of disgust and pity. Tinsley leaned into her new husband, a smirk playing on her lips. Rowena adjusted her pearls, nodding solemnly as if witnessing a tragedy. I did not stand. I did not flush red. I looked at Gideon with a calm, clinical detachment. I was counting the seconds, letting the silence of the room become heavy enough to crush the mirage he had spent 30 years building. Caspian stood up from the Abernathy corporate table near the front. He didn't shout. He simply spoke into the sudden quiet, his voice carrying the authority of a man who dealt in absolute values. "Mr. Gideon," Caspian said, "as a senior gemologist for the GIA and a consultant for the world's largest auction houses, I find your assessment of plastic quite interesting." Caspian walked toward me, the crowd parting like a receding tide. He pulled a jeweler's loop and a microscanner from his pocket. He held the scanner to the platinum clasp of the necklace. A sharp, digital beep echoed through the silent hall. "This is the Solace Pink," Caspian announced to the room. "It is crafted from solid platinum and features the only 4.2 carat pink diamond ever discovered in the Antwerp mines. Its market value is $1.2 million. He paused, his eyes shifting to Tinsley. "However, someone has clumsily replaced the central stone with a piece of crown glass within the last 12 hours. Fortunately, the original pink Solace diamond contains an Abernathy subsurface micro-tracker for insurance purposes." Caspian looked at his tablet, then pointed toward the altar. "According to the live feed, the real $1.2 million diamond is currently 6 feet away, pinned inside the bride's garter." The silence in the room didn't just deepen, it became suffocating. Tinsley's face went the color of her dress. Gideon's mouth hung open, his hand frozen on the microphone. Caspian opened the blue leather binder I had prepared. "Furthermore, since we are discussing financial embarrassment, perhaps the room should know about case number 7742-G. The $500,000 equity line Mr. Gideon forged his daughter's signature to obtain 3 months ago, or the $3,412,000 Helen has paid out of her personal dividends to keep this old money estate from foreclosure over the last 6 years." Following Caspian's signal, the AV team projected a single screenshot onto the large screens for the wedding compilation video. "Leo is a big boy, Helen. Don't be so dramatic. I'm at the spa." I stood up. I didn't walk to the podium. I spoke from my seat at the staff table, my voice low but cutting through the static of their shock. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," I said. "I came here to find out if there was anything left of my family besides a ledger of debts. I have my answer. You called me a burden while I was your bank. You called me embarrassing while I was the only thing keeping you from the street. You chose the mirage of status over the life of my son. That is the only embarrassment in this room." I looked at Gideon, whose eyes were finally beginning to see me, though it was 20 years too late. "I have purchased your mortgage, Gideon. I have purchased Tinsley's wedding debts. You don't owe the bank anymore. You owe me. And I am a much more meticulous auditor than the bank ever was. That's the boundary." I picked up my binder. I didn't look at Tinsley's tears or Rowena's trembling hands. I looked at Leo, who Caspian was holding near the exit. I set my water glass down on the staff table, the only thing I left behind. I walked out of the Riviera Country Club, the sound of my heels on the marble the only rhythm in the room. I stepped out into the Charleston evening. The air was salt-thick and honest. I wasn't the Gideon daughter anymore. I was simply Helen, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. The ballroom at the Riviera wasn't just quiet, it was vacant. The string quartet had packed their cases, leaving behind only the scent of wilted gardenias and spilled champagne. I stood by the kitchen door, the place where my father had told me I belonged, and watched the Gideon name dissolve. Guests bypassed Gideon and Rowena with a clinical efficiency, their eyes fixed on the exit as if my parents were a contagious misfortune. Tinsley sat alone in the center of the room, her elaborate lace train spread across the floor like a white shroud. The old order didn't break with a bang, It simply evaporated. Once the mirage of money is gone, there is nothing left but people who don't know how to speak without a script. 1 hour later, I was back at the Gideon estate. I stood in the foyer, the same space where I'd been managed for 30 years. I placed the navy blue binder on the mahogany table. "The forge is safe, Gideon," I said. My voice was low, devoid of the heat he expected. "Because I bought the deed to this house, too. The foreclosure was avoided, but the title is in my name. You have 30 days to find a rental you can actually afford." Rowena's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I slid a single sheet of paper across the wood, the final invoice for $3,412,800. "This isn't an argument," I whispered as she began to mention family loyalty. "It's an audit. You wanted a world built on appearances. I've just given you the bill for the set design." I didn't wait for the apology. I didn't need a confession to feel whole. I left them in the foyer and walked out. 3 months later, Charleston is quiet. It's 6 a.m. at the forge. Caspian is upstairs with Leo, the hum of a normal morning settling over us. Caspian had found my old hammer in a bin weeks ago, the one Rowena called an eyesore. I spent the morning polishing the steel. It's heavy, honest, and it fits my hand perfectly. I deleted the family group chat today. I didn't need them to see me to know I was a masterpiece. I just needed to stop letting them be my curators. To anyone else carrying a weight that doesn't belong to you, you can put it down. The world won't end. It will just finally begin to turn in your direction. I picked up my hammer and I got to work.